So in the last few videos, I was talking about Jung and reality, and I was talking about Christianity and reality, the referent of which is probably similar. But today I want to talk about psychedelics and reality. So this is part of a paper that I tried to write about rebirth, the motif of rebirth. In Christianity, there's the being born again is a common Christian trope. In Jung, there's the sort of archetype of rebirth. Uh, I'm not sure if he calls it an archetype, but he addresses it as an important theme. So today we're going to talk about LSD and rebirth, and the sort of most important person that I can find in the sort of LSD and rebirth world, although I think there have been some subsequent, and there probably were quite a few contemporaneous with Stanislav Grof. So Grof wrote a couple of books, 60s and 70s, after his LSD research, either, I think, both in California and Eastern Europe, where he administered what I think they were doing at the time was shockingly high doses. I don't know exactly, but I think 250 plus micrograms of LSD to patients. And so Grof writes a couple of books about the motif of rebirth in the patients to whom he administered relatively high doses of LSD. And there was a number of sessions. I can't remember how many, but it was probably less than 10, but more than 2 or 3, I think. So Grof gives LSD to his patients, and he notices that they experience rebirth. And with LSD, it's like a very visually, it's very similar to what I would imagine is the experience of birth as an actual baby. They seem to go back into the womb, which leads Grof to conceptualize the rebirth process as being sort of the stages of the rebirth process in Grof sort of map onto what would be reasonable ways to think about the stages of physical birth of an infant. So this is hyper literal, I think is one way to put it. But when we talk about LSD and reality, what I really want to try to get to is whether or not that rebirth process is, or to what extent is it similar to and also different from the rebirth processes that we observe primarily in the Christian religion. That's where I want to look. And then also to some extent for a sort of elaboration of the rebirth theme in Christianity in Jung and Jung's sort of half spiritual, half materialistic elaborations, which sort of paved the way, we might think, into the research of Grof, LSD, and the psychedelic rebirths. So in the Christian tradition, the notion of rebirth is really a notion of a new life and a turning away from the old life in what is often called repentance. And so you'll often hear the translation of repentance as turning from something old to something new. So repentance is, we might think, an act of a will. Some will, either the natural or the supernatural will. At this point, we're not going to really say much about it, although I think it would be sort of prudent to say something about it, but it's not really the place to do that. So in the Christian tradition, there is a rebirth. The rebirth is conditioned on a will, and that will is sort of active. It's the active cause or the actual cause of the turning. With Jung, you get less of that, from what I can tell. And then in the psychedelics, you get what I'm arguing here today, none of it. So the notion of the will being the active or direct cause of the repentance in Christianity, that cause, which is the will, is a psychological cause. With psychedelics, you don't get a psychological cause of the repentance. That's my argument today. And so what do I mean by repentance? So this is how we can start to bring Jung into this, because in Christianity, there are very specific reference of their linguistic system or their symbol system. There's very explicit reference. In Jung, those reference are relaxed. So the relationship between symbol and signified is looser than in Christianity. In Christianity, you get a very tight symbol system, which means you have a very low amount of application. It's sort of low resolution because you can't blow it up, right? To the bigger, you know, those who don't believe in the symbol. Like there's a high. One way to think about this, I suppose, is there's a high capital requirement for entry into Christianity, in the sense that you have to devote a lot of your resources to mapping onto this very small symbol system. With Jung, for example, this is what I want to say, this sort of evolution is there's less. You give over less. And so when I talk about repentance, I want to talk about Jung and Jung's symbol system, which refer to the unconscious. So repentance would be a turning away from the conscious attitude towards the unconscious attitude. Okay. So it's important to remember that in Jung, the unconscious is not just the place of repressed memories. The unconscious has a spontaneity and a sort of novelty of its own. So in the same way that we think a human individual is a unique person, Jung is suggesting that the unconscious contains the sort of seeds of the human individual, which means that it's not only empirical events that have been repressed, it's also coming from somewhere we know not what, which is what we might say about a human birth. We don't know where a human baby comes from. We can give some material causes, but we don't know where a human baby comes from. We don't know how to make a human baby out of nothing, which essentially means we don't know what it is. And that it might also, even if you had that, I'm not sure you would know what it is. Okay. So that's what repentance is. Repentance is a turning towards the unconscious, a turning towards we know not where, which is unique to the human individual for the purpose of a new life. And so the idea of repentance is you turn away from a conscious attitude, which is not, there's low fidelity between the conscious and the unconscious attitude, and there's a turning away from this for a desire for these to be more in balance, to live more from oneself, you might say. So in Christianity, the repentance is willed. A will causes a turn away from the world towards the unconscious. It's a free choice. Now, freedom, we can go into briefly. I'm just going to say that the definition of freedom, which says the human being is free, but not in a natural sense, in a supernatural sense. So the will, the higher will, is the will that works into the human being, and only that will is free. Only that will is free. So you make a finite choice to reduce the influence of your natural will. You can make finite choices that aren't like interesting, basically. The human being, because it doesn't have an agent. Because there is no actual agent. The ego is like it's not a real agent. Okay. So there's a turning towards the unconscious by a will, which is supernatural. The supernatural will is the will that is free. It's the only will that is free, towards which the finite human agent can turn and make a quasi-choice for the freedom of the higher will. So that's the Jungian idea. It's the turning towards the unconscious and the welcoming of this higher will. The cause of which now is the will. The turning is the will. And so it's not, okay, in Calvinism, we would say that the will, the only sovereign will, is God. God is the only one with sovereign will. So to what extent can then the human being, who is a finite creature, make a choice, right? This is what I was trying to get at. And the question is, I think, is the finite will, if it turns towards the higher will, what is the cause of that? And at least in the way we talk and think, it's a psychological cause or a spiritual cause. Whatever turns the finite will towards the unconscious is a psychological cause. Because just because that's the language game that it lives in, primarily. Now, you would move the psychological cause into the material realm of the body and the brain. If you think, right, I guess if you're living in 2024, that's what people do. So there is this gradual change from Calvinism, where it's the highest will, Jungian, there's some choice of will, but not really, but there is a higher emphasis placed on the human aspect of the will, which actually I think to its detriment, because they don't get the beatitude. Is the brain causing the turning of the will? If so, that would seem to be an antecedent cause. And so I'm not going to get into the relationship between brain and body, the free will studies and where they tried to measure whether or not people's hands moved before they made the choice to move the hand. It's like there's no way that's going to work. I wish it did, but it didn't. So it seems psychological. People tried to make the turning of the will biological. And then here comes LSD now. So repentance, the definition of repentance is the willful act of turning oneself away from the conscious world towards the unconscious world. That's a definition of repentance that is at least, quasi believable if you're living in 1950 and still think the unconscious is a real thing. Okay. LSD, the mode of action of LSD appears to be an introduction into neurochemistry of these exogenous psychedelic factors, whatever, lysergic acid, diethylamide, 25. Apparently it's 25 because it was the 25th thing that Albert Hofmann synthesized in this series of syntheses. And I think it was 5 years or 10 years or something till he actually tried it. Anyway, LSD is a exogenous psychedelic factor that has the appearance of repentance. Why? Because the unconscious contents are made conscious in the experience of LSD. And then, so the question becomes, to what extent is that making conscious of the unconscious similar to or dissimilar from the willful turning of the willful turning from consciousness towards the unconscious, from human to God? Because it seems to be doing the same thing. The analogy that comes to mind is in repentance, there's a willful turning towards the unconscious, whereas in psychedelic research, there is a heightened. Okay, so if you think of the mind as as a movie screen, which people have, the Cartesian theater. I think we can use it. Let's see if it works. The idea would be that, or if you think of it as a human eye, like the human eye sees, and then you get these little floaties in between your brain and your eye that have to do with the membrane and mucus sac behind your eye. So you get floaters because they say that the stuff clumps together, like that mucus, but in your eyeball between your retina and your the front of your eye, those things clump together, and so when the eye sees, it's seeing more of itself, basically. And that is what I'm suggesting is happening with psychedelics. Is psychedelics coagulate the eye floaters so that you see the thing that is doing the seeing, right? So in Jungian theory, we perceive the world through archetypes. So I might have an experience of a woman who I project the mother archetype onto, and then I'm not seeing her. I'm seeing her and my archetype, so I'm contributing, right? And I'm not going to go down the Kantian rabbit hole. I'm not going to do it. So I'm projecting my psychological preconceptions onto the world. That's what LSD is doing. It's projecting the psychological preconditions, psychological concepts, the a prioris of the empirical a prioris, which I don't mean I do mean we discover them empirically. That's my criticism of Kant, obviously. But they're also empirical because we project them onto the empirical world. That's what they're not like a prioris about math or something, which may or may not have to do with the empirical world. Anyway, so these empirical a prioris are projected onto the world just because they've coagulated in between the retina and iris is the front, so that you're just seeing more of the things that you use for seeing. Okay, so that's how I would contrast the Christian spiritual tradition with the psychedelic tradition. Is one is a turning away, and one is not a turning away. It's just a seeing together. So in the Christian world, we think of it like this, and right now I'm focused on myself. Actually, myself should be the dark one. I'm focused on myself, and then in the Christian tradition, through an act of will, the nature of which I'm not going to get into, I turn towards the unconscious, where God resides. That's the idea. With psychedelics, this is the analogy. With psychedelics, I'm looking at the human, but it's just reflecting more light. So I'm looking at the human, and then the unconscious, the divine, is sort of moved into consciousness. And so I'm seeing them at the same time in a way that I'm suggesting is not the case with religious devotion.